Imagine kneeling before the most powerful woman in the Christian world, and realizing with growing horror that her body is crawling with fleas, not just one or two, but dozens of them, moving beneath fabric so stained and filthy that you can smell her from across the chamber. This was the reality for those who served Queen Isabella of Castile in 1491, and what they witnessed would become one of history's most disturbing legends. But here's what makes this story truly terrifying. It might not be a legend at all. The year is 1491, and Spain stands on the edge of transformation. For 8 brutal months, Queen Isabella has been directing the siege of Granada, the final Muslim stronghold in a peninsula that has known 7 centuries of war. But something is wrong with the queen. Servants whisper in darkened corridors about the smell that follows her, about the way she prays for hours without moving, about the mysterious stains spreading across the white linen shift she refuses to remove. Some say she made a sacred vow before the altar of Cordoba Cathedral, a promise to God himself that she would not change her undergarments until Granada fell. Others claim she's been wearing the same shift for far longer, perhaps years, perhaps a decade. The details shift like shadows, but one truth remains constant. The Queen of Spain is living in a state of filth that would horrify even the poorest peasant in her kingdom. To understand why such a thing could happen, you must first abandon everything you think you know about cleanliness, about sanity, about the difference between devotion and madness. In Isabella's world, bathing was not a luxury denied to the poor. It was a sin actively avoided by the faithful. The church taught that to wash the body was to wash away the protection of baptism itself, to invite demons into pores left vulnerable by soap and water. Saint Jerome had declared centuries earlier that he who is bathed in Christ has no need of a second bath, and this philosophy had calcified into doctrine. The truly holy should smell like martyrs, like suffering made flesh. Blood, sweat, and sacred dirt were the perfumes of heaven. Isabella had learned this lesson young. At 17, she witnessed plague tear through the royal court at Segovia, watching as the disease selected its victims with seemingly random cruelty. But young Isabella noticed something that would shape her understanding forever. The dirtiest members of the court survived. Kitchen servants covered in grease and filth remained healthy, while nobles who occasionally washed their hands died screaming, their bodies covered in the characteristic black spots that gave the plague its terrible name. In her mind, the lesson was clear. Cleanliness was not next to godliness. It was an invitation to death. By the time she became queen, Isabella had embraced a spiritual practice that would have seemed insane in any other era but was celebrated as the height of devotion in 15th century Spain. 3 times each week, she would lock herself in her private chapel and strip to the waist, taking up a whip made of knotted cords. She would beat her own back and shoulders until blood ran down her skin, mixing with weeks of accumulated sweat and grime. This was not madness. This was prayer made flesh, suffering as communion with Christ. And the undergarments that absorbed this holy blood became something more than clothing. They became relics, repositories of sanctified pain that grew more powerful with every passing day of wear. The siege of Granada began in April, and if the legends are true, so did Isabella's ordeal. 8 months is a long time to wear the same linen shift in the brutal heat of a Spanish summer. Imagine the transformation of that garment, day by day, week by week. The white linen would have yellowed first, then darkened to brown in the places where sweat pooled most heavily. The blood from her self-flagellation would have created rust-colored patches that never fully dried. And then there would have been the other stains, the ones that servants dared not contemplate, evidence of bodily functions that continued regardless of spiritual vows. But the physical degradation of the fabric was nothing compared to what was happening within its folds. Fleas were everywhere in medieval camps, living in the packed dirt floors of tents, breeding in the straw mattresses, feeding on soldiers and horses alike. For a flea, Isabella's unwashed body would have been paradise. The warmth, the moisture, the accumulated oils of her skin, all created perfect conditions for these tiny parasites to thrive. And thrive they did, laying eggs in the seams of her shift, creating generations of fleas that knew no other home than the body of the Queen of Spain. What Isabella could not have known, what no one in her era understood, was that those fleas were not merely an uncomfortable nuisance sent by Satan to test her faith. They were potential harbingers of apocalypse. Medieval fleas carried Yersinia pestis, the bacterium responsible for bubonic plague, and a single infected flea could trigger an outbreak that might kill thousands. Isabella was not just risking her own life with her vow of uncleanliness, she was potentially creating the perfect conditions for plague to sweep through her army and beyond, into the cities and towns of newly unified Spain. If you're finding this journey into the darker corners of history as fascinating as I am, please consider subscribing. These forgotten stories of faith and filth, of queens and plagues, of the fine line between devotion and destruction, they deserve to be remembered, and your support helps ensure that we can continue exploring these haunting chapters together. Because history isn't always glorious battles and noble sacrifices. Sometimes it's about the intimate horrors that people endured in the name of belief, the suffering they inflicted upon themselves because they truly thought it would bring them closer to God. Contemporary accounts describe Isabella during those final months of the siege as a woman transformed, or perhaps deformed, by her ordeal. Her face had become gaunt, her eyes hollow and burning with an intensity that frightened even her closest advisors. She spent most of her time standing before a portable altar in her command tent, praying in a voice that had grown hoarse from hours of use. Visitors reported a strange smell emanating from her presence, not quite pleasant but oddly compelling. Like old leather mixed with dried flowers and something underneath, something organic and alive. That was the smell of her unwashed body, of fabric that had become a living ecosystem, of flesh slowly breaking down under layers of sanctified filth. On January 2, 1492, Granada finally fell. The Muslim leader Boabdil surrendered the keys to the city, and Isabella's vow, if it had ever truly been made, was fulfilled. According to legend, she finally removed the linen shift she had worn throughout the siege. The garments were supposedly so stiff with accumulated dirt, sweat, and blood that they could stand upright on their own, a grotesque sculpture of suffering made from fabric and filth. Some accounts claim that Isabella had the shift preserved as a holy relic, that it was displayed in the cathedral at Granada as evidence of her devotion and endurance. Whether this specific detail is true hardly matters anymore. What matters is that people believed it could be true, that such an act of self-degradation seemed not only possible but admirable in the context of late medieval Spanish Christianity. Isabella went on to rule for 12 more years, funding Columbus's voyage to the Americas, establishing the Spanish Inquisition, and shaping the course of world history in ways that still echo today. But she never escaped the smell of sanctity, the odor of unwashed flesh and sacred suffering that had become her trademark. The modern world looks back on stories like this with a mixture of horror and incomprehension. How could anyone, especially someone as powerful and intelligent as Isabella, deliberately live in such filth? How could an entire civilization celebrate uncleanliness as a virtue? But perhaps the real question is this: what beliefs do we hold today that future generations will find equally incomprehensible? What suffering do we inflict upon ourselves in the name of faith, beauty, or success that would horrify someone looking back from 5 centuries in the future? Isabella died in 1504, possibly from complications related to the chronic infections and parasites that plagued her throughout her life. She was 53 years old. As her body was prepared for burial, the servants who undressed her for the final time reported finding scars covering her back and shoulders, evidence of decades of self-flagellation. Her skin, they said, had an unusual texture, almost like leather, transformed by years of accumulation and neglect. They found other things too, things they refused to speak about publicly. Evidence that the Queen's relationship with cleanliness had never truly normalized even after Granada fell. The fleas that had lived in her clothing, if the legend is true, scattered when her warm body grew cold. They sought new hosts in the palace, in the cathedral where she lay in state, in the crowds that came to mourn the Queen who had unified Spain and funded the discovery of the New World. Whether any of those fleas carried plague, whether Isabella's devotion to uncleanliness had inadvertently spared Spain or endangered it, we will never know. What we do know is that in the pursuit of heaven, she had created a small piece of hell right there against her skin, and she had worn it like a crown of thorns for years beyond counting. The question I'll leave you with today is one that haunts me every time I explore these dark corners of history. When does faith become fanaticism?